Ready to go.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this legislative wrap-up. We have with us today Lester Abinger, who's our legislative representative, Alex McGee, who's our past executive director. Thank you for joining us today. Thomas Hawkins with UF, and Whit Blanton, our president, including myself, the president-elect. And I just wanted to let everyone know this is being recorded. We will let you see this throughout the rest of the year, through the end of the year, on demand. If you have questions, please place them in the question box, which you should see on your right-hand side. We will answer those at the end of everyone's presentation and field those as applicable. There is a PDF, as you can also see. It's a handout in the handouts box if you want to download the presentation. And this is also going to be available for CM credits for you AICP planners. There is one law credit available or 1.5 just regular CM credits. So you'll have to choose which one you need for your record. And with that, I think we will start with Thomas. Or Lester. I'm sorry, we're starting with Alex. I apologize.
Lester.
Lester, I'll get it right.
I'm here. Good morning. Thank you. Is the audio clear?
We can hear you.
Very good. Well, we had quite a legislative session, as I'm sure you all know. And I would call it one thematically as characterized by the so-called culture wars, abortion, gun rights, K through 12 curriculum, the battle between the governor and the Disney people, and the governor's, in some context, his national political agenda. As we've discussed before, primarily, in my opinion, and as a consequence of term limits, we're working in what I call a leadership-driven system, and that is the priorities of the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate are very, very important in terms of what happens during the session. There's also a compounding factor in the sense that the Republican Party enjoys supermajorities in both the House and Senate, so they're able to do essentially what they want to. As I said, the priorities of the House Speaker and the Senate President drive the agenda. Senator Pasadomo, the Senate President, was very, very focused on affordable housing. We'll get to more details on that shortly. And the Speaker, Paul Renner, was supportive of a massive school voucher expansion program, which also passed. There were 1,873 bills filed. To date, only 356 of those had passed. The budget included 1,550 member projects, and your American Planning Association Florida chapter tracked carefully 182 bills with specific planning implications. And I want to thank Patty and Stephanie and Alex for the great work that they did on helping us follow those bills. Another overarching theme of the session is the continuing parade of preemptions, that is, bills that threaten local government autonomy. There were 58 such bills filed this year relating to issues such as short-term vacation rentals, municipal utilities, and the worst of which was a bill that would have totally preempted local government regulation of water quality, quantity, and permitting. So again, a lot of preemption bills, and I think we will continue to see those going forward. The budget came in 500 pages, $117 billion, an increase of 7.4% over the current year fiscal year budget. And just for a little bit of context, again, the budget at 117 billion. The budget in Texas is 127.6 billion, and the budget in New York State is 229 billion. The budget has not been formally conveyed to the governor yet. After it is, he'll have 15 days to deal with it. And the speculation here is that there'll be up to $3, maybe $4 billion in vetoes in the budget. The highlights in the budget include robust spending on the state K through 12 education system that serves 2.9 million students, and also includes the 12 state university system institutions and the 28 Florida college system institutions. As usual, one of the largest categories is the funding for the Medicaid program, which provides health care for 5.7 million Floridians. There's robust transportation spending, including an extra $7 billion to expedite road construction projects. The budget also has $10 billion in reserves, which helps the state's credit rating and help us deal with natural disasters. And there's a 2.5% increase for state employees. There's a $1.3 billion tax relief package, largely sales tax holidays as in past years. The priorities that were identified by your legislative advisory committee under a large leadership and with strong support from Whit were identified for us to oppose the 20% cap on transit spending. That bill was killed. Thank you, Whit. There was a business impact statement bill imposed on local governments, but we were able to achieve what I call a carve out, so it won't apply to planning and development regulations. We were supportive of the creation of the Everglades Protection Area. That bill, for the first time, passed the whole Senate, and it moved in the House, but it didn't quite make it to the finish line. Similarly, we were supportive of historic preservation tax credits for Florida Main Street cities, and that bill also did receive hearings and moved further through the process than it has in the past, but did not make it to the finish line. Affordable housing, as I said, was Senate President Pasadoma's priority. Fully funded the Sadowski Act and turned out to yield about $711 million for affordable housing in Florida, which was one of our main emphasis during this session. The other emphasis that the LPC identified was conservation spending, and it was a spectacular year for conservation spending, almost $1 billion, by far the largest in Florida history. $750 million for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which stretches from the Big Cypress Swamp in Collier County almost to the Florida-Georgia state line, and uses the Family and Rural Lands Protection Program as a vehicle to fund the acquisition of conservation easements primarily. $100 million for the Florida Forever program, $15 million for the Florida Communities Trust program, $11.7 million for local parks, $50 million for springs restoration, and $100 million for the Rural and Family Land Stewardship Program. So I hope that's been a useful overview for you, and I look forward to answering any questions that I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Lester. We appreciate your thoughts. Before we get into the bills that have passed, I'm just going to talk real briefly about some of the bills that died. I think it's of interest to do that because some of these you'll likely see next year. So what would a legislative session be for Florida without us dealing with vacation rental legislation? So we had several bills that dealt with that. Senate Bill 92 and House Bill 105 never were heard in committee, but Senate Bill 714, which would allow grandfathered local ordinances to be amended to be less restrictive, would allow restriction of the maximum occupancy of vacation rentals if it was applied uniformly to residential properties, and would have allowed local governments to create their own vacation rental registration programs. That bill actually was passed by the Senate, went to the House, had an amendment put on by the House. The Senate didn't concur with that amendment and sent it back to the House where it died in messages. So you'll probably see that bill again. There was a bill that died that would have required plans and plan amendments in Miami-Dade within 2 miles of, or in the Everglades protection area to follow the state coordinated review process. That bill was passed by the Senate, but it died in messages in the House. So I would assume it's going to be refiled next year. Another bill that came back from last year was the tax credit for historic structures. That was the second year that it was submitted. The Senate version died in its final committee, and the House version was never heard in a committee at all. That's a little better than it did last year, so I would imagine it's a bill that's proposed by Florida Trust, so I would think they're going to continue to try with that. And then there were a number of bills that dealt with permit review timeframes, processing, that kind of stuff. Some other bills that didn't pass. There was 2 bills that would have required specific tax increases or reenactments to be placed on a general election ballot. That failed. The prohibiting of drilling or exploration for oil, gas, petroleum in the state of Florida, and the requirement that 100% of the electricity used in the state be generated by 2050 from 100% renewable energy. That was actually never heard in committee. The DOT funding the planning and construction of public use vertiports was never heard in committee. I actually, when I was looking at these bills, I didn't know what a vertiport was. And it actually is defined as infrastructure, a system with supporting services and equipment intended for landing, ground handling, and takeoff of manned or unmanned vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL aircraft. I don't know if that includes drones, but that was just a weird bill, and I had never heard the term, but it was never heard in committee either. There was a couple of bills that would have allowed for the establishment of citizen-initiated infrastructure resilience districts. That bill was passed by the, oh no, that had not been heard in committee. The Resiliency, Safe and Structures Act, that would have prohibited local government from demolishing certain structures unless it was for public safety. That was passed by the House, but died in messages. I mean, passed by the Senate, excuse me, but died in messages to the House. The electric vehicle bills were never heard in committee, and the constitutional amendment to increase the percentage of votes required to approve an amendment or a constitutional revision that would have raised it from 60% to 66.67%, passed the House but died in the Senate Rules Committee. So it may be heard again. So those are some of the bills that we had followed that died. So now let's talk about what did pass, and I will turn it over to Thomas.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to go through 5 bills here and give notes on them. And to the extent that I'm superficial, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up during the Q&A portion. The first bill, House Bill 89 or Senate Bill 512, makes changes to local government reviews of certain permits, most specifically building code permits, but also life safety code and fire code permits. It essentially requires local governments, if they're notifying an applicant that they don't meet the standards, to identify the specific plan features that don't meet the standards, cite to the applicable code provisions, and convey that in writing. So generally, this seems like good government practice, but of course, combined with time limits that are imposed on local government review processes can create obstacles and challenges for local governments in complying. This applies both to an initial review and to a review after a permit's issued, to the extent that any changes happen to the permitted development proposal in that time frame. And any local government employees who fail to comply with this are not just necessarily in trouble with their local government, but actually can have reprimands related to their licensure certification. Slide. The next bill, which is Senate Bill 170 or House Bill 1515, makes broadly three changes. One, it has sort of a glitch protection regarding continuing hearings and requirement for continued notice. Second, it has a new requirement for government to produce business impact statements. And then third, it creates a new cause of action for folks to sue local governments over local government ordinances. So first, looking at hearings, this actually results from a case in South Florida earlier this year in which a court deemed that local government notice was not adequate because the local government, at a properly noticed hearing, continued the item under discussion to a future hearing and then did not re-notice the agenda item for that future hearing. And the court found that that didn't meet basic due process requirements for notice. That's a typical local government practice, nonetheless, and the legislature here is explicitly allowing it. So local governments may continue things to a date certain if they meet statutory requirements. Slide. Next, local governments for all ordinances subject to exemptions, and I'll go through a long list of exemptions in a minute, but by general applicability, all ordinances, local governments must prepare a business impact statement. The statute explicitly says this doesn't require an accountant or other financial consultant, but some of the criteria of what must be included in a business impact statement seem pretty specific. So I've got 4 bullet points down here describing what goes in this review. It includes businesses' compliance costs. So what does it take for the business to comply? Any new charges or fees the local government imposes, what the government expects to have in additional revenue, and what it expects to spend to enforce compliance with the ordinance. And then finally, an estimate of the number of impacted businesses. I think specifically on the first and last bullet points there, those are not things that local governments necessarily have expertise in, and so may be challenging for some local governments to generate. Slide. So here's a list of the exempted ordinances, of the exempted subject matter for ordinances. And remember this, because I'm going to cross-reference this in a second, even though I won't reproduce the list, but it's a pretty extensive list that includes lots of areas of local government regulation. So definitely check this list if you're considering whether you need to draft that business impact statement. For the interest of local government planners and planners in the private sector, the biggest one there is that 4th bullet point from the bottom, which is implementing the Community Planning Act. Everything in Chapter 163, Part 2, including the Community Planning Act, is exempt. So that's quite a few ordinances that we'll deal with are not required to prepare this business impact statement. I put this under the heading irony. The Florida Constitution requires that the state prepare certain reports of fiscal impacts when it's considering a statute that might be an unfunded mandate on local governments. And the legislative analysis by staff on this bill noted that it would be an unfunded mandate, but that they had not prepared a fiscal impact statement for how this bill would impact local governments. So of course, exactly what the local government is directing, what the state is directing local governments to do, it's not doing for itself. Next slide. All right, and this is the 3rd and final change from Senate Bill 170. It creates a new cause of action for folks to challenge local government ordinances. So there's 2 grounds on which somebody can challenge a local government ordinance. I'll talk about each of these in a second. One is the grounds that it's expressly preempted. And the second is that it is arbitrary and unreasonable. If a lawsuit under this new cause of action is filed, it suspends enforcement of the local government ordinance. The party bringing the lawsuit has an opportunity to recover up to $50,000 in attorney fees. That is not available for the defending party. It's not available for the local government. And that same list from the previous slide of subject matter that's exempted from the business impact statement is also exempted from this new cause of action. So this does not include bills adopted pursuant to local government authority under Part 2, Chapter 163. So next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what express preemption is. Recall that there's two kinds of preemption. Subject matter can be expressly preempted to the state, meaning that the state directly says, hey, we're going to regulate in this area. And subject matter can also have an implied preemption, meaning that state regulation of an area creates a really high likelihood of conflict between local rules and state rules. This cause of action only applies to that express preemption. As local government employees working on drafting ordinances, we don't have to be too careful there. Next, arbitrary and unreasonable basics. Y'all remember from your graduate courses in land use law, hopefully, that language arbitrary and unreasonable relates back to the fairly debatable substantive due process standard. And it essentially means two things. One is that every local government law has to have a relation to police powers, meaning it has to be adopted for a public purpose, no nefarious or private purpose, or just laws adopted for no reason at all. And then second, there has to be a reasonable connection between how the law functions or works and accomplishing that public purpose. And so that's what the reference is to arbitrary and unreasonable there in the new statutory language slide. All right, moving right along to Senate Bill 718. This makes three changes, all of which relate to municipal annexation or contraction, and one relates to referenda on land development regulation. Slide. Oh, I thought I had more there. Let's go back and talk about those bullet points in a little bit more detail. So the prohibition on referenda for land development regulation, y'all will recall that we've had in statutes for quite some time a prohibition on referenda for comp planning or referenda for individual development permit approvals. This adds to that list that's prohibited land development regulations. And then I'll just focus on the last bullet point here. We've had a provision in statute for a while that if local governments were going to annex land, where the majority, the 70% of it was owned by folks who weren't voters because they were corporations, or they weren't electors, they were non-residents of the county, or they just weren't registered to vote, that it also, the local government had to seek the approval of those landowners as well. And now that same standard is being applied to municipal contraction as well as annexation. Now we're ready for the next slide. All right, this is Senate Bill 1604, which has been adopted in law. This is now part of the laws of Florida. It also went by the name House Bill 439 during the session. It's got 4 significant changes. It extends comprehensive planning periods. It revises the evaluation and appraisal process. And it has changes related to electric substations and the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Slide. So the changes to the comprehensive planning periods are essentially that the planning timeframes are being extended from 5 and 10 years to 10 and 20 years. And the real significance of this is that local governments need to be using those longer horizon population projections for planning purposes to determine what land uses they need to accommodate, what residential densities they need to accommodate, and what capacities they might need through facilities they're planning in their capital improvements element. Here are the changes in the evaluation and appraisal process, and this is interesting. Now, the sort of leading elected official, the chair of a board of county commissioners or the mayor of a local government, needs to attest at the time that the local government completes an evaluation and appraisal letter that it is using the appropriate data and population data for the longer time frame. If it fails to comply, and there's some more process that's built into the statute here, some relationship with DEO and DEO actually providing the appropriate data if it believes the local government hasn't used the right data. But if all that fails and we get to a point where the local government's not following these standards, it can no longer adopt publicly initiated comp plan amendments, but it can adopt comp plan amendments that are requested by somebody that goes through a privately initiated process by paying an application fee. And of course, the emphasis on all of this is ensuring that the population data being used is high enough and not being used to limit the development capacity in a jurisdiction. Slide. As regarding electric substations, we already have in the statute, or prior to this law, had in the statute a local government preemption from regulating the placement of electric substations in certain land use categories. This adds to that list accessory buildings and structures related to the electric substation. So now somebody who has an electric substation could build, for example, a warehouse or some other accessory structure when local governments are preempted from regulating that additional development in certain land use categories. And then lastly, there's some language prohibiting the new Central Florida Tourism Oversight District from enforcing the development agreement that Walt Disney World entered into with the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which was the predecessor to the CFTOD. The statute does not mention Reedy Creek or the CFTOD or Disney by name, but I know from the fantastic webinar that 1000 Friends of Florida did last week, Jane West did some specific research into this and knows of no other special district that's subject to these standards, and I don't either in looking at it. So it's clearly targeted at that ongoing dispute regarding administration of that special district that coincides with the land owned by most of the land owned by the Walt Disney Corporation. Next. All right, this will be the last bill that I cover, Senate Bill 250, which was also during the session, House Bill 7057. It makes lots of changes to Florida statutes related to natural emergencies, and I'm gonna go through them pretty quickly. It requires the Division of Emergency Management to post a model debris removal contract on its website. It encourages, but does not require, local governments to create emergency financial plans in advance of natural disasters. And then it has a preemption on local governments. If a residence is destroyed during a declared state of emergency, the local government must allow someone to have a temporary dwelling placed on the property for up to 36 months and subject to certain criteria, such as that it's occupied by the property owner. These are things like trailers or other temporary portable housing. And there is another limit in addition to the 36 months. If the property owner gets a certificate of occupancy for the principal dwelling, they can no longer occupy the temporary structure. Let's see, next. Local governments may, by interlocal agreement, create sort of a cooperative response team for permitting in the wake of a natural disaster. And then local governments are required, and this is shall mandatory language in the statute, to approve certain permits in the wake of a natural disaster that the statute describes as not requiring technical review, and then gives a list of examples that are not limiting, such as re-roofing or replacing single doors and windows. All right, and then it makes an extension to certain outstanding permits during a natural disaster. Preempts local governments from increasing fees for certain permit reviews after a natural disaster until 2024. And then lastly, and this is really interesting and perhaps frustrating for local governments that were impacted by recent hurricanes. If you are within 100 miles of Hurricane Ian or Hurricane Nicole, your local government is preempted from adopting more restrictive, and again, that's a term that's subject to a little bit of ambiguity, but more restrictive comprehensive plan policies or land development regulations through October 2024. And that bill is retroactive. So anything that's been adopted since September 28th, 2022 is void and not in effect. It also prohibits adopting moratoria. And then finally, the last things that I'll touch on, there's currently a revolving loan program in statute that's been made permanent or extended until 2038 that's called the Local Government Emergency Bridge Loan Program that the Division of Emergency Management, that the Department of Economic Opportunity will manage, and then a second loan program that the Division of Emergency Management will manage, and both have been funded in this current fiscal year. Great, thanks. I'm going to pass it over to Alara.
Thanks, Patty. So I have 5 bills I'm going to discuss. And the first is Senate Bill 540, which was sponsored by Senator Nick DeSiglia of Pinellas, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. His companion bill, or a companion bill, was House Bill 359. And this bill is amending 163-3184 to allow prevailing parties the ability to recover attorney's fees and costs associated in an administrative challenge or defense of a plan or plan amendment. This includes appellate attorney's fees and costs. It also creates a new exemption that prevents the local land development regulations from applying development standards to a Florida college system institution, which is defined in Florida statutes, other than those that pertain to use, intensity, or density of the use. And that's 163-3202, Part 6. It limits an aggrieved or adversely affected party that wants to challenge a development order for consistency to the comprehensive plan in regards to use, density, or intensity of the particular use on the property. So for example, if you had a policy in your comprehensive plan, say in the conservation element, that talked about setbacks to protect a water body, a pristine water body, and outstanding Florida water, that would not be available for a challenge for consistency on the issuance of a development order any longer. And it will effectively disallow a challenge based on any other environmental protection, hazard mitigation policy, or any local preference that the comprehensive plan reflects. I'd like to note that Florida APA sent a request to Governor DeSantis to veto this bill, which is counteractive to his executive order that was issued this year, Order 2306, which sought to improve local government long-term comprehensive planning that ensures sustainable growth while protecting our natural resources. You may also know that we sent out a call to action a few times, and 1,000 Friends of Florida has also sent out this call to action to request the governor to veto this bill. You have until tomorrow to send that request. He has until tomorrow to veto the bill, at which time it will be set to become law, which will be effective of July 1st of this year. So if you have not already, I would encourage you to send in that request maybe after this presentation today. Next slide, please, Patty. This is a rural development bill. It's an economic development bill, House Bill 1209, sponsored by the Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. The companion bill to this was 1482, filed by Representative Simpson. This bill pertains to our 3 rural areas of opportunity and to rural communities. To offer context on this, the rural areas of opportunities, the RAOs is what I'll call them, are designated by the governor. And we have 3 established, which is the maximum the statute allows. These include the Northwest Rural Area of Opportunity, which is commonly referred to as Opportunity Florida, and exists along the I-10 corridor from Gadsden County to the northern part of Walton County and Liberty County and Calhoun County in Northwest Florida, which are all west of Tallahassee. The South Central RAO, referred to as Florida's Heartland Regional Economic Development Initiative, which includes DeSoto, Okeechobee, Hendry, Highlands, and some cities within that area, such as Immokalee in Collier County. And then the North Central Rural Area of Opportunity, referred to as the North Florida Economic Development Partnership, which includes Baker County, Madison County, and those counties in between along the I-10 corridor down to Suwannee and Putnam counties. Rural communities are defined in Florida statute in 288.0656 as a county with a population of less than 75,000, or a county with a population of 125,000 with which is contiguous to a county with a population of 75,000 or less, or a city within those two designated areas above. And so this bill will add requirements for agency agreements that provides federal or state funded financial assistance to a local government that are defined as rural or as a RAO, that where an invoice can be paid to the local government or verified and eligible completed performance as allowed by law. So if there's a federal law that doesn't allow that, that will not be available to them. So it's as applicable by prevailing law. It also amends the Rural Infrastructure Fund. It increases from 50% to 75% the funding of private or public infrastructure improvement projects within a rural community, which is also located within a fiscally constrained county or a RAO. It can also be used to improve inadequate infrastructure. This bill removed the language that included funding for broadband internet service access. I know that had been a problem, especially with the Opportunity Florida RAO, and raised the cap on funding for infrastructure feasibility studies, design, and engineering activities to $300,000 from $50,000. It also is good news for these constrained communities in that it removes the local match requirement of 50% for feasibility studies, surveys, and other review of pre-clearance review analysis within a RAO. This bill is not yet transmitted to the governor as of yesterday when we last checked, and the effective date of this bill will be July 1st. Next slide, please. So the next bill is House Bill 1379, was sponsored by the Infrastructure Strategies Committee, the Water Quality Supply and Treatment Subcommittee, with several co-introducers. The companion bill is Senate Bill 1632, sponsored by Senator Brado of Seminole County. This is a very long bill. It was 95 pages, so we're just going to hit some of the high points here. Generally, this bill creates and repeals various provisions relating to procedures and requirements for the acquisition, retention, and disposal of state lands and prioritization of projects relating to such lands. Has a new requirement to include in our capital improvement schedule a list of projects necessary to achieve the pollutant load reduction attributable to the local government as established in a basin management plan. Requires the infrastructure element to now, some people refer to it as infrastructure, you know, the water, sewer, aquifer recharge element, coordinate the treatment or upgrade and treatment of facilities to meet future needs, and prioritize advanced waste treatment for increased capacity. This bill dedicates $100 million annually to DEP from the Land Acquisition Trust Fund for the acquisition of lands through the Florida Forever program. It also creates new requirements for the infrastructure element regarding the development of more than 50 residential lots with more than one on-site sewage treatment and disposal system per acre, such as a septic tank for subdivisions of less than one dwelling unit per acre, with some considerations. So I encourage you to look deeper into that. These policies must be included in the comprehensive plan by July 1st of 2024. And it does exempt local governments located within a RAO. So those RAOs that I mentioned earlier, if you are a local government within one of those designated boundaries, the RAOs, that you are exempt from these requirements. This bill also amends 259.105 to require Acquisition and Restoration Council to give lands located within the Florida Wildlife Corridor increased priority. The Florida Wildlife Corridor are areas that run from Northwest Florida down to south to the tip of the peninsula. There are actually 18 million acres encompassed by the corridor, and currently about 8 million remain unprotected. The corridor seeks to provide additional connectivity of the corridor, as it's kind of in a patchwork condition right now. So that's good news. And this bill also amends 570.71 and 570.715 related to conservation easements and agreements. Thank you, Patty. To allow DEP to give preference to lands in imminent danger of development or degradation, or lands within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And this bill was submitted to the governor on May 16th, and the effective date again is July 1st. So next slide, please. House Bill 111 was sponsored by the Agriculture Conservation and Resiliency Subcommittee with several co-introducers. The companion bill on this one was Senate Bill 1170 by a senator out of the Miami-Dade area. This bill generally addresses flooding and sea level rise vulnerability studies and purposes for which DEP may provide grants under the Resilient Florida Grant Program to local governments and water management districts. It expands the Resilient Florida Grant Program, which is good news, to include funding for nature-based solutions that reduce the impact of flooding and sea level rise. It is more involved for water management districts to support local government adaptation planning. It offers grants for the purpose of supporting the Florida Food Hub for applied research and innovation, and supports DEP through the data creation and collection, modeling, and implementation of statewide standards. Priority is given, however, to the Florida Food Hub. This bill impacts a state-financed constructor who now may not commence construction of a potentially at-risk structure of infrastructure with conditions which include conducting a SLIP study that meets DEP requirements and submitting that study to DEP, and then subsequently receiving notification from DEP that the study was received and published on the DEP website for at least 30 days. Next slide, please. Requires the DEP to develop by rule the standard by which the SLIP studies must be conducted, and may require that a professional engineer sign off on the study. This bill provides that the state financier constructor is solely responsible for ensuring that the study is submitted to DEP and meets the study requirements. It also requires DEP to publish and maintain a copy of the SLIP study for 10 years on their website, and also includes opportunity for civil actions to occur if the state finance constructor commences construction without complying with the SLIP study. It can seek injunctive relief to cease construction and to enforce compliance, and can seek recovery of all or a portion of the state funds expended. And as of yesterday, this bill has not been transmitted to the governor, and the effective date will be July 1st of this year. Next slide, please. This one was also a very large bill, Senate Bill 102. We refer to this as the Live Local Act, also sponsored by a senator out of the Miami-Dade area. This one was also, it was a 95-page bill, so quite lengthy. The companion bill on this was House Bill 627 by the State Affairs Committee. This bill generally removes local authority to adopt or maintain laws, ordinances, rules, or other measures that have the effect of imposing controls on rents. Provides an exemption of an ad valorem taxation for land that meets certain criteria. Authorizes local governments to adopt ordinances to provide an ad valorem tax exemption for portions of properties to provide affordable housing meeting certain requirements. It does suspend for a time certain the general revenue fund service charge on dock stamp collections. It also authorizes the governor to approve state or local public infrastructure projects to facilitate the development or construction of affordable housing. The appropriation for this bill is $711 million. I did try to take a look at the bill's analysis, the fiscal impact statement, which is online if you'd like to take a look at it. It is 39 pages long, so it's another lengthy document. Importantly to us, it will impact our ability to regulate the use, density, or height of affordable housing developments. So if affordable housing is coming in, we cannot require a plan amendment, zoning change, or FLUME amendment, future land use map amendment, in lands designated for commercial, industrial, or mixed use if at least 40% of the residential units are affordable. and that is defined in 420.0004. It also permits density at the highest allowable within the local government, regardless of the category that it's in. So if you have another category within the comprehensive plan outside of the parcel that this affordable development project will be located on, it's allowed to use that higher density limitation. It also permits the height of the structure to reach the highest allowed for commercial or residential development within a mile radius of the parcel, or 3 stories, whichever is higher. And it will exempt workforce housing development in the Florida Keys from hurricane evacuation of that 24-hour standard that you have down there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Patty. Thank you. And there's a few more things happening here. You can go through these as you need to, but this bill was the Senate President's bill, so it was on a fast track. It actually started in committee before the first of the year. And you can go on to the next bill, Patty. This was actually signed by the governor on March 29th of this year. So there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to react to this one. And the effective date on this one is July 1st. So that would cover my 5 bills, I believe. So we will transfer over to Whit.
All right, thanks, Laura. Good afternoon, everybody. I've got a few bills that I'll cover that primarily deal with transportation. And there's a little bit of good news and bad news in both of these bills. The first one I'll cover is House Bill 1305, which was the Florida Department of Transportation's bill. And generally speaking, this bill focuses on streamlining provisions for several areas of the Department of Transportation's work activities. It also adds a number of additional flexible funding provisions that primarily relate to rural areas. So for instance, this allows and I'll just say FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation, to provide 100% of project costs under the Intermodal Logistics Center Infrastructure Support Program in rural areas. And if you are familiar with FDOT discretionary programs or some of these other off-system programs, generally that requires a match with local governments. So this is an incentive for these programs in rural areas primarily. It also allows the Florida Development Finance Corporation to finance certain DOT-related public-private partnership projects. So that's, again, additional flexibility that the department will have as a result of this bill. It provides FDOT when doing airport site approvals that they may not necessarily require written memorandum of understanding or a letter of agreement from other airport sites regarding air traffic patterns, separation procedures, et cetera, unless it's required by the Federal Aviation Administration or unless they deem it necessary. So again, kind of a streamlining provision there to reduce unnecessary coordination, apparently. The last or the next little piece here I'll mention is that it allows FDOT to fund up to 100% of eligible project costs for publicly owned, publicly operated airports located in rural communities as defined under State Statute 288 that does not have regularly scheduled commercial service. So general aviation airports, cost of runways, taxiway improvements that add capacity. These projects must be prioritized based on available non-state matching funds, but it gives the DOT the ability to fund up to 100% of those eligible costs, and also economic development transportation projects pursuant to 339. So that is an interesting streamlining provision as well. Next slide, please. This bill allows DOT to increase from 120 to 200 million cap on innovative transportation projects that they may annually award, and deletes the cap exemption for low bid design build, milling and resurfacing contracts. Again, more streamlining and flexibility for the department. It increases the DOT contracting cap when it is not required to receive competitive bids up to $500,000 instead of $250,000. It expands the potential use of phase design build by FDOT by authorizing them on any FDOT project rather than specified ones, and providing options for phase design build contracts. This is, again, a streamlining and project delivery aspect of the bill. And the department has increasingly gone to design build provisions, but they've been restricted in the past to only specific types of projects that they can do design build. So this opens that door considerably wider. And here's one that's kind of fun and close to home. This one requires that by the end of the year, the Metropolitan Planning organizations, including my own, that serve Hillsborough, Pasco, and Pinellas, must submit a report on the feasibility, the benefits, costs, and process of creating a single regional Metropolitan Planning organization for the core part of the Tampa Bay area. This has been a long-standing conversation in our region since probably 1990, and has led to a pretty good level of coordination. But I think that there's a general sense among the legislature that this region would function better if it was more integrated in terms of a single governing board and a single staff entity serving the region. This report would essentially be a feasibility statement rather than a mandate that they merge. So there's still a number of hoops that would have to happen beyond the report. And then this requires DOT to adopt by rule minimum safety standards for any governmentally or privately owned fixed guideway transportation system located within an independent special district created by local act, which has boundaries within 2 contiguous counties. Who has Disney on their bingo card? Because that pretty much focuses on the safety aspects of the Disney monorail system. Next slide, Patty. There's a couple of other aspects here. This transfers the Santa Rosa Bay Bridge Authority's bridge system to FDOT, and then allows DOT to transfer it to the Florida Turnpike Enterprise to take advantage of more of the statewide system resources and competitive opportunities. And then this also provides that the Greater Miami Expressway Authority is reestablished, subject to revised powers and duties outlined in the bill. And this has been a long tug of war over several sessions involving the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority. The governor approved this on May 11th, so all these provisions are now effective July 1st, 2023. Okay, the next bill I'm going to talk about, generally we're very supportive of, and this one didn't cause any real heartburn to APA Florida. The state's popular shared use non-motorized trail network, otherwise known as SunTrail, has been around for quite a few years and has created a number of trail systems, primarily the Cross Florida Trail and the River to Sea Loop Trail in Volusia County area. And a lot of counties around the state of Florida have benefited from the SunTrail program. And this really focuses on the Florida Wildlife Corridor provisions of that to prioritize the development of regionally significant trails, which are defined as crossing multiple counties, serving economic and ecotourism development, showcasing wildlife, ecology, and natural resources, and serving as main corridors for trail connectedness across the state. This enhances the planning, coordination, and marketing of that trail network and the wildlife corridor. And it stipulates that trails developed within the wildlife corridor use disturbed lands and already areas that have abandoned railroads, canal corridors, or drainage berms, something that Brevard County has been talking about for a number of years, and that they be compatible with land use provisions. It also allows FDOT to add uniform signage for the SunTrail network, and then gives the DOT and local governments the ability to enter into sponsorship agreements instead of just basic concession agreements for trails to be used, and that can be used for maintenance, signage, and related amenities. So that does provide a little bit of new revenue streams for that ongoing operations, which is sometimes a challenge for local governments, particularly smaller local governments, to handle the ongoing operations and maintenance of the trail network. There are a number of trail towns in Florida, and this recognizes those trail town communities and direct specified entities to promote the use of trails as economic assets, including the promotion of trail-based tourism. And we held our retreat this year in DeBary, which is one of the newer trail towns in Florida. And I think most of the trail towns would welcome this type of promotion. And then the big news is that this puts a lot more money into the Sun Trail program from a base of $25 million that was originally authorized for only 5 years. That has been extended and now is up to $50 million annually and provides for non-recurring appropriation of $200 million to plan, design, and construct the Sun Trail network. The governor approved this on April 11th. It was a priority of the Senate president, and it's pretty neat to see good bills like this fly through the legislature quickly. It's tough to see the bad bills fly through quickly. Next slide. All right, the last bill I'm going to cover is another transportation bill. This was an industry bill, and there's some good provisions and some concerning provisions in this one as well. It expands Florida's move over law to include disabled vehicles. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get the move over law to pertain to vulnerable road users. That's something that has been a recurring desire, but at least it now includes disabled vehicles. So baby steps. Maybe we'll get the vulnerable road users next. It requires FDOT to coordinate with and establish standards for the state highway system to be graded according to their compatibility with the operation of autonomous vehicles. So there's a lot of autonomous vehicle language in this bill in general, but that's one provision. It also allows for the department to work with airports on noise regulations to provide where a noise study has not been conducted for a public use airport, that mitigation prohibition shall be considered in airport land use compatibility zoning regulations. And then at the University of Florida, the iStreet program, I won't go through the whole acronym, you can see it there, and it provides for the implementation and duties related to transportation research, education, workforce development, and that also deals with emerging technologies, autonomous technologies, and such. And then finally on this page, it authorized FDOT to share up to 10% of construction cost savings due to a change in contract design or scope initiated after contract execution with the design, construction, engineering, or inspection consultants that had a hand in realizing those cost savings. So that's pretty interesting. Next slide, please. This bill would delete statutory language that prohibits FDOT from requesting legislative approval of a proposed turnpike project until the design phase of the project is at least 30% complete. So this is a little bit concerning in that it precludes legislative intervention in certain turnpike-related activities in the planning stage or PD&E stage, and it's much harder to intervene once you're spending a lot of money on design and you're at 30%. And here was a big aspect of the bill relating to metropolitan planning organizations that started off far worse. This bill had some pretty nefarious language concerning the MPO Advisory Council, which is an independent advisory council that serves as a conduit for information sharing and research and best practices among Florida's 27 MPOs. The original version of this bill would have placed the MPOAC fully under the authority of the Florida Department of Transportation and would have stripped the MPOAC of its ability to win grants and conduct best practices research. So it didn't go as far as the original bill. The revisions by Esposito were helpful, and the MPOAC does retain its authority. However, there are some restrictions that have been placed on the MPOAC as part of this bill. But significantly, some of the changes in the bill made it a little bit better and more palatable to existing MPOs because there was language previously that would have required the MPOs to evaluate consolidation statewide. And I've heard from legislative leaders who have said that they feel that Florida's 27 MPOs are far too many. And while language in this session specifically calls out the Tampa Bay area MPOs for consolidation, I would not be surprised to see attempts in future sessions to force or encourage or incentivize the merger of other MPOs around the state. And the fact that this changed at the last minute is good, but it means that those bits of language may come back. Essentially, there's no real terrible provisions in here. It requires additional coordination for MPOs that are designated where they have overlapping urbanized areas, and ensuring that there's the consistency of data among MPOs. That doesn't necessarily sound bad, but for redeveloping counties, for instance, the state's Bureau of Economic and Business Research does not necessarily do a great job of covering the growth and development in redeveloping areas compared to growing areas. This bill also requires a report of the consolidation of the MPOs similar in the Tampa Bay area, similar to House Bill 1305. However, this bill has not yet been transmitted to the governor, so this is already law in the other bill. And then it allows for the strategic intermodal system to require that FDOT address the movement and storage of construction aggregate materials essential for building roadways in its transportation plan. So that covers House Bill 425. I did want to highlight a couple of other bills that we were tracking in Pinellas and that I think are important for the rest of the state. School zone speed limits. Safety has been a huge issue around the state, and this would allow municipalities and counties to opt in to use speed detection systems similar to red light cameras within school zones to enforce speed limits and ticket and warn drivers who are exceeding 10 miles an hour when children are going to and from school during the entirety of the school day. So that again is a tiptoe into greater use of technology when red light cameras generally have been restricted and removed in a lot of counties around the state. It requires the county or municipality to put in an ordinance regarding the placement or installation of speed detection devices and to make a determination on the location of such a system for enforcement action. It also requires a public awareness campaign prior to issuing tickets and commencing that enforcement. And it requires the local government to hold public hearings regarding contracts and data reported to the state Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles Department. And then it prohibits points from being issued, but it does set an amount for fines. And so we believe that this could be a pretty good disincentive for speeding through school zones. This has not been approved by the governor, but it has been presented, and it'd be effective on July 1st. And related to that, we have a chronic problem in a lot of our urban areas and maybe rural areas as well about people who pass school buses that are stopped. So Senate Bill 766 would give school districts the authorization to install cameras on school buses to use detection systems to capture violations for people who fail to stop for a school bus. It requires the school district to enter an interlocal agreement with the law enforcement agency authorized to issue those violations and with the school district to establish enforcement responsibilities and cost reimbursement. I've heard that clerks of court don't necessarily like this bill because it adds a considerable amount of work for the clerk office, but this is also a safety provision, and it seems like it's something that should be considered by local school districts. It specifies that school buses have high visibility reflective signage on the rear of the school buses indicating that the system is in use, and it outlines the enforcement process, penalties, and reporting requirements. Again, it hasn't been approved by the governor, so it's just been presented, and he's got a few days to make that official.
Thanks, Whit. I'm going to, before we head to questions, just go over a few of the bills that APA Florida was filing, or that was following, that have passed. This first slide is bills that passed and have been submitted to the governor. He is required to take action on them by May 31st. And I just want to highlight one on this slide, the disposal of property, Senate Bill 678, which is a bill by Senator Powell, who is a member of the organization. And this bill would provide that DOT can convey property to a government entity without requiring any kind of consideration if that property is to be used for affordable housing. And if that is signed by the governor, not vetoed, it would be effective July 1, 2023. And then if you go to the next slide, I just want to highlight two bills on this slide. These have passed, but they have not yet been submitted to the governor. The first one I want to highlight is House Bill 5, which is economic programs. It eliminates Enterprise Florida, transfers all of its duties and functions to the Department of Economic Opportunity, and now for the second time in recent history will rename the Department of Economic Opportunity to the Department of Commerce. So it will go from DEO to DOC. Then the last bill I want to highlight is House Bill 1489, which is the designation of the Brevard Barrier Island area as an area of critical state concern. This one I found personally interesting because I started my career back in the Bureau of Land and Water Management, where was the original GRI program and the Area of Critical State Concern program. And I won't tell you what year that was, but we haven't had an area designated as an area of critical state concern for, I think, since 1985. And so this area is defined in the bill, and when an area is created as a area of critical state concern, the legislature kind of lays out what it's trying to achieve. So for this new area, it's the intent of the legislature to do four things. One is to establish a land use management system that protects the natural environment of the southern Brevard Barrier Island area. Second is to establish a land use management system promoting orderly and balanced growth in accordance with the capacity of existing public facilities and resources. It is to protect and improve the Indian River Lagoon ecosystem, including improving water quality of the area through federal, state, and local funding of water quality improvement projects, and to ensure that the population of the Brevard Barrier Island can be safely evacuated in the event of a hurricane. And this bill would become effective July 1st, 2023. So at this point, we are ready to answer any questions you have. On the slide that you're looking at, you can see the actual numbers that you need to use if you're going to request SAM credits. The number for today's event is the 9270122. And then if you look at it later, it's 9270255. So I will turn it back over to, I guess, Alara or Whit for handling of the questions.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for participating. There are some really good questions right now. The first one I'll throw over to Thomas, and to ask you if you're aware, or do you know if there will be a template or a go-by for that business impact statement you mentioned during your presentation?
I do not know. That the bill does not call for any state agency to create a template. That sounds like a great project for maybe an APA committee. But given the number of ordinances that are the local governments that are going to need to comply for such a huge number of ordinances, it's not going to be long before we're going to be inundated with examples.
Okay, great. Whit, I think I might throw this one over to you. Which bill required FDOT to study including radioactive gypsum into the road building aggregates?
I don't remember if I have the specific bill for that, bill number for that, but I did read about that. And I think what it does is it tries to give the department more flexibility again with the types of materials it can use, because the costs of materials for road building have been astronomically high the last several years. I know there have been some concerns expressed about the impact of radioactive materials in road building, but I'm not exactly sure which bill that was. It might have been in 1305.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So another person is asking if we are currently engaged in our EAR process, do the new regulations in Senate Bill 1604, House Bill 439 apply? And I'll let Thomas, I'd like to get his opinion, but I would say I have done a couple of years recently in the past few months for a couple of county governments, and I have encouraged them to go ahead and submit that before July 1st, so that would not be subject to the new criteria. But Thomas, do you have an opinion?
That is a novel question for me. I'm going to check that the effective date is July 1, 2023. So I would say that if you're intending to adopt anything related to your evaluation and appraisal process after July 1, it should comply with the new law. But consult with your city or county attorney for certainty.
Yes, so thank you for that. Senate Bill 102, does the preemption of the Flume Amendment for affordable housing also override any other provisions of a comprehensive plan, such as density increase in the coastal high hazard area, or requirement of mixed use in a mixed use future land use map amendment? So it sounds like the answer to that is yes. We did have some concerns about how this would override any kind of efforts in the coastal high hazard area or hurricane evacuation numbers and timelines. So do you have an opinion on that, Thomas? I think that we were very concerned about how this would impact those kinds of situations, but it was not made clear that that would be exempt, even at our request in the legislation.
Well, that's another bill that the LPC worked on and developed a lot of comments, and we conveyed those to Senator Powell, who met with the Senate President. We put together talking points for him, and we conveyed a letter also to the Senate President about that bill. And I expect that there'll be a large, what we call a glitch bill next year. They were in such a hurry to get that bill passed. And it's understandable in light of our affordable housing problems in Florida. But the people that I've talked to in the Senate President's office tell us that we can expect to see a glitch bill next year.
Thank you, Lester. That was helpful. Senate Bill 250, back to you, Thomas. Does the permit expediting for windows, doors, and other kind of building materials prevent historic district requirements?
I would certainly think so. I would think that the language does not include certificates of appropriateness. So if you have a standard in your local code that requires a certificate of appropriateness, I would think that would protect the integrity of your district. This is just for building permits that, quote, don't require technical expertise. And so that I would not think that includes a certificate of appropriateness. And certainly sometimes before you do routine building maintenance, if your code requires a COA, certificate of appropriateness, you've got to get one. And again, check your local council.
Right. Yes, I think that's our disclaimer on all of these questions. It's important to get with your local council to make sure that you're all on the same page with these responses. There have been a couple of questions about the handouts. We want to make sure everybody can see that. There should be a handouts tab on the right-hand side of in the pull-out panel. There's a PDF there to download the presentation today. Let's see, regarding changes to Senate Bill 540, it sounds like a very broad exemption for the Florida college system. Does that include rules regarding access management? Do they still have to go through the permitting process, or are they able to self-permit? And I wonder if you're asking about maybe access from a DOT road. I would still assume they would have to get a permit from DOT for access to a DOT road or a driveway permit to a local government. But I, again, would urge you to get with your local council to see if there's a better interpretation at your level, or even call your DOT representative to see how they've interpreted that. Let's see. Part of the Live Local Act mandates local governments provide written policy and process information to the public. Is there a coordinated effort to streamline this for local governments by providing model process for certifications for qualified parcels? And I will say, not that I'm aware of. This is all very new. Some of these, like Lester said, there might be some tweaks to this in the coming years or the coming months for next year's session. So is anyone else aware of anything that might be a coordinated effort to streamline this process for information for modeling to the public for a process of certifications for the qualified parcels? No? Okay, yeah, just keep tabs on that, keep a lookout. We're not aware of anything, so keep checking back. Thomas, if Disney is able to sue and win over the Reedy Creek issue with Senate Bill 1604, would that impact the other changes to the bill?
I typically, I haven't checked to see if the bill has a specific severability clause. There's just so many questions in there. It would depend on the theory and the litigation. You know, are they just prohibiting the bill from applying to them? Are they, you know, attacking the legitimacy of the bill itself? I don't know. I would certainly not count on that.
Well, I don't think anybody knows right now. And it's, as Thomas pointed out, we're going to have endless litigation on that bill.
Yes, I agree. Let's see, these questions keep moving around on me, so I'm trying to keep track here.
Laura,
yes.
And I don't know if this is the answer. You had asked a question, somebody had asked about a bill that dealt with a certain kind of aggregate.
Yes,
and
in the roadway.
There is a bill that was, I don't know if this is the aggregate that they were interested in, but House Bill 1191, which deals with the use of phosphogypsum, was passed, and it has not been submitted to the governor yet, but it basically authorizes DOT to undertake demonstration projects using phosphogypsum in road construction aggregate material and to conduct studies on it as a construction aggregate material. So if that was the material they were looking at, it's House Bill 1191.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Laura,
There are, yes.
I just wanted to point out, in terms of the Senate Bill 540, that, as you said, we're urging the governor to veto that bill. And we've been joined in our veto coalition, I call it, by Florida Audubon, and also, more importantly, by the Everglades Coalition, which is 27 organizations and about 12 million members. So we're trying to really generate a lot of activity in terms of contacting the governor's office about a veto on that bill. Thank you.
Well, that's good news. Thank you, Lester. And yes, if everyone has a minute after this presentation to contact the governor's office, that would be amazing to get that word out. Yes. There are a couple of questions regarding Senate Bill 102, the Live Local Act, regarding how that might impact a planned development or a PUD. Is that interpreted as a mixed use kind of district? And I'm going to let Thomas help me answer this, but I would say yes, because a PUD does allow for a mixture of uses. So if it's a mixed use district, I think this bill would apply to that category. Do you agree, Thomas?
I haven't read the bill with this question in mind. My thinking is if you are you talking about allowing what a complex project that you would normally permit as a PD in one of these categories that now must have allowed multifamily or mixed use? Is in that circumstance, I would say that's a poor fit for the way the bill is structured, because the standard is 40% affordable units. And so if you're trying to measure the number of affordable units in a very, very large project, you're not going to hit. I just that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If instead you're talking about in an existing PUD, if someone can now permit affordable multifamily, I would want to read the bill with that question in mind to double check, but that seems like it would be allowed. That seems consistent with the way the bill is designed to function.
Yeah.
Right, I agree. And I think that 40% threshold is important, that they do have to meet that in order for these regulations, this legislation to kick in. So that's a pretty high threshold. So the question, we have a question that I'm not sure that we can answer because I don't know if we have this information, but have any governments started to create an administrative review process to address housing projects utilizing Senate Bill 102? And I would say it's pretty early for us to know whether or not any local governments have started to create a review process for addressing this, but that might be something you want to look at later in the year or maybe next year as time progresses. This isn't effective until July 1st, so it's still pretty early.
Yeah, Laura, I'll just speak to Pinellas County. We did, what we adopted was a target employment and industrial land study that was completed largely before this bill was passed, but it kind of provides that regulatory framework, and we feel like we were pretty good at hitting the mark on what the legislature's intent was, and we've allowed, as part of the countywide plan in Pinellas, housing to be built within our target employment areas, activity centers, commercial areas, consistent with the bill. So that is a regulatory framework. I'd be happy to share the target employment and industrial lands study findings with anybody who's interested in that. St. Petersburg has also put together a really nice framework for the previous House Bill 1339, which was a few years ago. And I think those provisions would also at least provide a basis for 102 consideration as well.
Great, thank you, Whit. Thomas, Senate Bill 718, prohibiting referenda for land development regulations. Does this apply retroactively to communities that already have these requirements in place?
I don't think. I think that if you have an existing charter provision that relates to how you issue land development permits, and a great example is a lot of coastal communities have charter amendments related to building height. My reading of this is you couldn't have a referendum to remove that provision from your charter, but you also could not have a referendum to add new similar provisions to your charter. That's my understanding of it.
Okay, let's see. I think that might be it.
Laura, I answered some questions in the chat, so.
Okay. All right, I am looking at the questions. Just to remind everybody to put your questions in the questions tab so that we can see them. There is a chat, but I'm only seeing Patty's comments in the chat. So there is one more question. I see, how will local governments and neighborhoods combat the extreme height limits being allowed by the Affordable Housing Bill and other negative consequences on the incompatible sites? Yeah, that's a challenge for us all, isn't it? It's something that we're all going to have to kind of evaluate and try to remedy in the coming months, and maybe we can coordinate with each other to figure out how to address consistency and compatibility issues that we are going to face with this bill.
Well, it's the other bill that passed that we talked about takes away Citizen 540 citizens' rights to.
That's right.
To sue, or at least they will have to pay for the attorney's fees as well. So there's a real disincentive for that. I just, as a little editorial comment, the #1 occupation of former state legislators seems to be county commission. And I wonder if, depending on which side of the dais they sit on, if they're a county commissioner, if they're going to regret some of these actions, because I think they're going to hear from constituents in a number of communities.
Thank you, Whit. Lester, someone is asking if you could clarify what you meant by the glitch bill that will be introduced for next year's session.
Well, we're not certain of any specificity with that, but that was just the comment I made was a consequence of a meeting that I had with somebody in the Senate President's office, and they were aware that this bill has a lot of nuances and that they may need to be addressed going forward. And we'll probably look for something. The committee meetings will start in September, and the interim committee meetings to prepare for the 2024 session, and we will certainly be following it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what I would say is if there's a sense that there are some groups who are working on a glitch bill, then we would want to be very engaged in that as early as September. Yep. When committee meetings start again. And I suspect if there is to be a glitch bill, we'll hear about it well before September.
Yep. And I'd like to give a lot of credit to the team at the Florida League of Cities. They did a really fine job during the session, again, in the context of all of those really, really bad preemption bills. A lot of the art of what we do is to make bad bills not as bad, and they did a fine job. We worked closely with them, with Jane West at the Thousand Friends of Florida. So it was a real team effort. I don't want to leave anybody out, but I think it's important for our members to know that we work effectively, I think, in coalitions with other organizations that share our interests.
There's one question in here real quick I'd like to address. Chuck Barmby asked about the Moving Florida Forward initiative that the governor proposed, which was $4 billion in general fund that would leverage another $3 billion in borrowing money for FDOT to advance transportation projects in the budget. My sense is that the legislature, and I need to go back and confirm this, only authorized the $4 billion part and not the $7 billion part. So the projects that were on the list statewide are not going to be completely fulfilled by the budget that the legislature passed. And what I've heard from FDOT is that the focus will be on the I-4 Champions Gate area, which most people have been through, is a pretty miserable experience. Because that is probably a couple $2 billion alone for that fix. So we had one project in District 7, and I'm told that that's not likely to be funded because of the shortfall in Moving Florida Forward.
Let's take one more question, I think. Thomas, do you know if there are maps or boundaries that will be used to identify the Indian River Lagoon and other basins described in Senate Bill 1604?
I don't. I'm not familiar with those provisions.
We'll keep tabs on that. There's also a question if there was a way that someone could get a copy of any of reviews that we have conducted as APA Florida on any of these bills. If you contact the chapter office, they will try to connect you with any information that we have produced. And so with that, I would like to just add real quickly something that Lester mentioned. We were working very closely with the Florida League of Cities this session with Charles Chapman, who is their lobbyist over there, to provide comments and tag on to some information that they were providing to the legislators. So it was a coordinated effort this year with that organization when we were addressing legislation. So worked really well, and I hope to do that again in the future. It was very productive. So with that, I think we are out of time, and we want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you for your support, and hopefully everyone can get the word out about Senate Bill 540, and we will see you next time.